Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Shuchandra Ghosh, Professor, Department of Ancient Indian History and Culture, University of Calcutta. Today we will be talking under the broad subject of Indian culture, and the theme is Economic History of India from the earliest to the 17 to 7 AD, and the topic of my discussion is Urbanization of North India, which spans between 6th century BCE to 3rd century BCE. The objective of this paper is to make you understand about the different kinds of Janapadas that were in presence during the time of the time bracket that we are talking about, and how urban centers developed in these Janapadas. So, here you can see a map where you have the names of the 16 Mahajanapadas, and among the 16 Mahajanapadas, many of them turned out into a very important urban center. So, what we find is that the age of the Janapadas witnessed immense development in agrarian economy, resulting in the formation of urban centers. Now, incipient urbanism is noticeable by about the early 6th century BC at some sites, and the Ganga plains describes conditions that are prelude to urbanization. So, when we look at the later Vedic texts, the locations, we find that there is a change from chiefdom to the territorial states in the Ganga valley. So, this transition from chiefdom to the establishment of kingdoms and oligarchy in the Ganga valley is also linked with the emergence of urban centers in the region. And here we have a very important marker, cultural marker, that is the northern black polished ware, which suggests urbanism. It is a kind of a pottery which is a deluxe pottery, and you can see from this picture that this pottery was used primarily in the urban centers of the period. There are actually different kinds of markers for urbanization, and one of the markers, as I have mentioned, is the northern black polished ware, but we have other markers too, for example ring wells, and then we have different kinds of potteries that also talk of urbanism. Here is again a piece of bowl which is the NBPW, this is a northern black polished ware bowl, and then we have this map actually shows you the entire distribution of the northern black polished ware. So, you can see from the sites, and this famous black polished ware were found from the time period of 7th century BCE, and it continued till like the 2nd century BCE. Now, this period from 600 to 2nd century, then urbanization in this period has been termed as second urbanization, because we have that urban centers were visible in textual accounts and also in field archaeological materials from 6th century BC. This is regarded as second urbanization in Indian history because the first urbanization is the Harappan experience. The genesis of the urban centers are not uniform and they give diverse features. The cities, and what is important is that the cities in the Ganga valley were the epicenter. So, there were few cities which were outside the Ganga valley. So, when we talk about second urbanization, we have to remember that there was an epicenter, and the epicenter was actually the middle Ganga valley. Now, about the nomenclatures, that how do you know, but by what names the urban centers were known in our textual and epigraphic records. So, we have this term called Nagara, which denoted an urban space which occurs for the first time in the Taittiriya Aranyaka. Then again we know about Panini. Panini can be dated definitely around the 5th century BCE, and he was also aware from his writings, we know that between a distinction between Nagara and Grama, and he mentioned that Nagaras were located to the east, implying the Ganga valley, as he himself was a resident of Sialkot in present day Pakistan. Panini also affirms that cities were not necessarily results of random growth, but they were products of a deliberate design. When we study urbanization, it is very important to understand that it is a process. Urban centers did not develop at one point of time. So, there are as we are talking about the categories of nagaras, there are different categories of nagaras which are enumerated in the Pali canonical texts, and it enlists at least 60 Mahanagaras at the time of the great demise of Buddha, which were distinct from the lesser known nagaras which were known as the Shakha nagaras. So, now out of these 6 Mahanagaras, there were Champa, then the 6 were very important, and these were Champa, which is located in Bhagalpur in Bihar, Rajagriha, Sarnath near Varanasi in UP, Kaushambi near Allahabad in UP, Sravasti, Sayatmat in UP, and Kushinagara, that is Kasia in UP. And besides these Mahanagaras, we have reference to other important urban centers like Ahichatra near Bareilly, Hastinapur situated in the Delhi Meerut region, Mathura near the present day Mathura, the excavation site is Song, Vaishali, that is Basar area near Muzaffarpur in Bihar. Moreover, when we talk of the different categories of Mahanagaras, also we find that there are other terms. For example, Pura. Pura is a town associated often with fortifications. Nagara was also a town, and then we have a kind of a market town which is known as a Nigama, and a Nigama was perhaps between a Nagara and a village. We have a very interesting classification of another exchange center which is known as the Puta Vedana. Now, cities where we know that cities were located in regions with fertile soil and highly agricultural potential, and so in this many regions arteries of trade networks also facilitated the emergence and growth of urban centers. We can have a look at the trade routes. There were 2 different kinds of routes, one was the Uttarapatha and the Dakshinapatha. Here we are actually talking about the Uttarapatha which linked from eastern India to Taxila and further. Now, coming back to when we talk about the city, the layout of a city in the text is very important, because this is a very important source for our understanding, and so we find that the literary description of a city often refers to imposing fortification walls, gates and watchtowers of cities, excellent residential structures, the regular presence of merchants. The persistent feature of a city or an urban center is a porikha, that is a moat, and a prakara, that is a rampart, which had towers and gates. So, normally there was one in all the directions, but there could be many more. And we find that ideally in the text, the city was laid out in squares, 4 or 6. So, every city had its suburbs, sometimes spread over a considerable area. Now, going back to the archaeological data from the textual sources, we find that archaeology has revealed massive fortifications in some of the sites. In fact, although direct archaeological evidence of settlement hierarchies is not yet sufficiently clear, fortified cities of considerable size from a period are found throughout North India. So, earliest of these are at Ujjain, Kaushambi, Rajghat, Rajgir can be dated to the 6th to the 5th century CE. Others at Ahichatra, Champa, Vaishali, Mathura, Shravasti and Pataliputra were built in the 4th to the 2nd century BCE. We can have looks at, if you look at the urban site of Kaushambi, George Erdossi has done a wonderful work where we find the hierarchies of the cities. So, there are different categories of cities within the site of Kaushambi itself. Fortification, as I mentioned earlier, was a very important part because we have this prakaras, and then generally it consisted of an earthen rampart with a corresponding moat, and they were crowned with parapets. So, the size is enormous, that in addition to defending settlements both from attackers and floods. The building of these ramparts involved not only considerable feats of engineering, but also the organization of a very strong sizable labor force, indicating a significant change in the level of social organization. So, the labor had to be organized to build up huge ramparts. And we have the fantastic example of the Cyclopean wall at Rajgir, where you have a continuous existence of a wall and built with stones, and therefore, these are called cyclopes, the big boulder like stones, and it is called the Cyclopean wall. Rajghat also gives us some idea of the structure or the layout of an urban center. Some of the Mahanagaras we find that fit in well with the nomenclature that we find in the text. So, at Rajghat, as I mentioned, a fortification wall has been found in the pre-NBPW phase. Shravasti was a flourishing site of craft production. It experienced incipient urbanism prior to 6th century BC, but flourished as an urban center only in the 6th century BC. And two other very important sites are Sringaverapura and Kara, being located in the banks of the river Ganga, and both are often in identical size of 12 hectares. Sringaverapura is also very famous for its hydraulic project. So, if we look at the excavation of Sringaverapura, you will find that it is a huge hydraulic project in that period. Then Shravasti was it was a very important Buddhist center. So, it becomes, and it was from a crafts village, it was turned into an important urban town, urban center. Two very important potteries that are found, or potsherds that are found of different shapes and sizes in the most of the urban sites, are black and red ware and the NBPW. I have already talked about the NBPW, but black and red ware are very common potteries which were used in regular life, and NBPW were deluxe potteries which were generally used for luxurious feeling. Now, urbanization has also a strong linkage with trade. So, it was definitely a contributing factor for urban development, but of course, it was not the most significant agent of change. And here we can find with the example of Pataliputra that we have Buddhist texts which refers to Pataliputra as Pataligamo, because it is located at the junction of the river Ganga and Son, and has been described not as a Nagara but as a Putabedhana. I have mentioned earlier that term Putabedhana, which means a trade center where merchants were expected to break, that is Bhedana, the lid or seal, that is Puta of the merchandise. So, as a center of trade, the Putabedhana acted as a warehouse, and we find this transition from Pataligamo to Pataliputra in the writings of the different Buddhist texts. Buddha himself actually talked about that one day he can visualize the change of Pataligamo to a very important Agga Nagara. The term used is Agga Nagara, and a very important urban center. So, Buddha's prophecy came true, and Pataligamo was transformed from a trade center to a leading urban center and the apex political center of the Magadha after Ajatashatru's reign. We can in Patna there is the site of Kumrahar, where you still have some evidences of the important site of Pataliputra. Now, let us think of the markers. When we hear about so much of second urbanization, what could be the markers? And we find that the houses in urban centers were equipped with facilities like drains, that is drainage was very important, ring wells and soakage pits, which became archaeological markers of the second urbanization. Crafts production was also another important feature of these urban centers. Shravasti actually experienced incipient urbanism prior to 6th century BC. It flourished as an urban center only in 6th century BC. So, you have incipient urbanism where it is the beginning of an urban center, and then the transformation into a proper urban center in case of Shravasti. Ring wells were absolutely necessary if you find that it has to be, it is an archaeological marker for urban centers. Coinage. Now, when we talk of coinage, monetization, it is naturally monetization comes in, and an important aspect of urbanism is monetization. So, which is actually emergence of coinage. The question of medium of exchange is inseparably linked with trade and transaction. We have these terms in the Pali text called Kahapana or Karshapana, which is matched by archaeological evidence of silver punchmark coins of many sites. So these coins could be of different shapes, like that could be round, square, rectangular and of bent burr shape. Bent burr coins were generally found in the northwest part of the subcontinent. The coins do not carry, they are not inscribed, they do not have the name of the ruler, but they carry several devices which were punched only on the one side of the coin, and therefore it is known as the punch marked coins. Interestingly, when we talk of second urbanization, a very important debate took place among the historians and the archaeologists regarding the use of iron technology in second urbanization. The remarkable agrarian development, according to D.D. Kosambi, R.S. Sharma and N.R. Banerjee, lay in the development of iron technology and the availability of iron implements for agriculture. Iron technology is perceived to have been simultaneously instrumental to the clearance of forests and improved crop production as well. Thus, there was an agricultural surplus with which both the urban population and functionaries of the emerging states could be sustained. Now, this view of the emergence of urban centers in the Ganga Valley with the help of the iron technology has been questioned by Amalananda Ghosh and D.K. Chakraborty. It has been pointed out that the application of iron technology is evident mostly in the manufacture of weapons and less in the making of the tools and production. Amalananda Ghosh suggests that iron technology was not an indispensable factor in clearing the forest and ploughing the alluvial soil in the Ganga Valley. Formation of cities and formation of states are actually interrelated and not isolated processes. Both are witness to transformation of a society from a relatively simple stage to the more stratified phase. So, the advent of cities also coincides with the emergence of coinage, a tradition which indicates brisk trade and exchange related activities and proliferation of marketplaces. No less striking is the remarkable specialization and diversity of craft products evident from textual accounts. We have innumerable number of references to craft products. Iron and social change in early India is a text which talks about the different debates that I was talking about a few minutes earlier. Now, we have to understand that what are the factors that were responsible for the growth of urban centers. The genesis of these urban centers was not uniform and thus they had different features. We cannot say that all the urban centers had the same kind of origin. So, it was not a blanket origin. Some grew out of political and administrative centers and were the hub of power such as Hastinapur. It was, we all know, that political center of the Kuru Janapada. Again, others grew out of markets located at places where there was an agricultural surplus which could be connected to the exchange network. For example, Ujjaini. Ujjaini was a very important urban center because it was the hinterland of different ports and other places. Then now when you have lot of surplus, this surplus has to be gathered and distributed in such a way that it is acceptable into the society, and herein comes the role of the political authority. Thus, urbanization and formation of states are interdependent. We have from photographs, we know of the beautiful view of the river Shipra, which was located at Ujjain. Ujjain is actually on the bank of the river Shipra. Now, continuing with the factors that were responsible for the growth of urban centers, we find that apart from market centers, apart from having a very strong hinterland, there were religious places or the sacred centers where people regularly gathered and for pilgrimages, and finally they were transformed into an urban center, for example, Vaishali. And we have to keep in mind also that a small urban center was larger than a large village. The residents of an urban center pursued different kinds of professions. So, there is multifunctional aspect of an urban center. There could be merchants, there could be craftsmen, there could be administrators, and these were not food producing people. So, they depend on the villagers for their sustenance. So, what we find is that in case of the development of an urban center, the non-agrarian sector is linked with the agrarian sector of the village. In urban centers, we find that with the growth of different kinds of professions, occupations, we have a kind of an organization which are like guilds, and these are known as by different terms called as Shreni, Puga, Shangha. So therefore, manufacturings and artisans were always organized, and particularly in this period guilds were very important because the rulers were also supporting these guild like activities, and therefore we find the beginning of the organizations which had a very cohesive character. Artisans were a dominant class of the urban milieu. Then what are the sources from where we know about the guilds? So we have inscriptions that talk of the guilds of the later period. In this case, we have a lot of references to guilds in the Jatakas. The Jatakas talks about localization of the guilds, and then it talks about the different kinds of quarters, that whole villages were inhabited by one and the same class of artisans. For example, we have reference to Dantokaro Bithi, Rajoko Bithi, that the washermen. Then these villages has to be very large, because we have in a Jataka the reference to Mahavadhaki Gama. In this Mahavadhaki Gama, there were more than 1000 families of dealers in wood. And then we have also the separate presence of a Kammara Gama. The village of the blacksmith also had the same number of families, that is more than 1000. So all these naturally point to the very organized character of crafts and industries which were localized to some extent in this period. Overall, if we look at what we have talked about in the entire period of our study, we find that textual sources points towards urbanization in two ways. One was description of some villages which specialized in some professions such as blacksmithing, pottery, carpentry, cloth weaving, basket weaving, and many others. So these were villages which were close to the raw materials and were linked to the trade routes, which helped in the transformation of a city. Now, the character of the city shows that a city accommodated diversity. A city accommodated different kinds of ranging identities, and there were different types of people who were inhabiting a city, coming from different social strata and diverse religious sects. So it was a political, social and economic space. An urban center is a beehive of activity, of movement, of convergence. People from different areas are coming and meeting at an urban center. So it has us as a special space to be separated and protected, where king occupied, of course, the central place, the administrative authority. So we have a very interesting statement by B.D. Chattopadhyay. He says that when we look at the literature tells us more eloquently about the cityness of the city beyond its physical contours. So what we have seen is that when we look at an urban center, we find that this period from 600 to 2nd BCE to roughly 3rd century BCE, this period is known as a period of second urbanization in Indian history, because it was different from the first urbanization, which we all know it was the Harappan system. Then what we find is that here we have certain markers. The markers, how do we know that which is an urban center? The markers are, for example, use of northern black polished ware, black and red ware, then soak peats, then we have terracotta ring wells. Monetization was also a very important part of urban centers. We have coinages, we have talked about coinages, particularly in this period coins are not inscribed, they are not having any ruler's name. So it is, we have to depend only on the different kinds of symbols. The manufacturing technique was punch mark coins. Then we have proliferation of crafts activities. Lot of craftsmen are found in the Pali canonical text, like we have the reference to Bardhakis, the Kamaras, and artisanal activities became very important in this period. Finally, we find that if we look at the layout of the cities, the layout of the cities had two very important aspects. One was the porikha, that is the moat, and another was the prakara, that is the rampart, and these were necessary to save from invasions as well as from inundation, that is floods, because most of the cities were situated on the bank of the rivers. If we look at the origin of the urban centers, different urban centers had different kinds of reasons for being there. For example, Ujjaini was important because it was a hinterland, it had a very strong market and it had linkages with other areas. Vaishali became an urban center because of its religious background. Then we have centers like Kaushambi, which shows hierarchization within an urban center. So, George Dorsey has shown it. Then we have different kinds of walls, for example, Rajgir. Rajgir is a very interesting urban center because you have the presence of a cyclopean wall. So, ramparts were very important for this region. And when we look at in a total manner the entire factors that were responsible for urbanization, we find that an urban center had some specific characteristics. For example, it had an identity of its own, and this identity comes from the functional activities that were being present in the urban center. So, you have different kinds of craftsmen, people were thronging from different places. So, it is a center of convergence also. So, there are divergence and a center of convergences. Then we have, this is a space which is actually very separated, very important, and where the king has a central position. And finally, what comes out from, if we look at the urban centers, that there is a kind of a cityness, and which has, and beyond, we have to look beyond the physical contours of the layout of the city, and we find that the cityness of the urban centers, the multifunctionality, the different types of people, you have a weaver, you have a carpenter, you have a washerman, you have a blacksmith, you have potter. So, different kinds of occupational groups living together. So, this multifunctionality gives a different kinds of cityness, which was talked about by B.D. Chattopadhyay. And finally, what we saw in this, that there was a debate regarding the use of iron in the germination, in the emergence of an urban center, and this debate shows that it is not only iron technology, with that we need with that we need the presence of the government, the state. So, state and urbanization are interlinked with each other.